That is to say, this would be the smoky side of Glenal here, just like Valitin of Caradur. But how are you, dear friends of Talking About Whiskey, your favorite whiskey channel? My name is Eduardo, and here we are again in Madrid, the capital of Spain, to make a new interesting video about whiskey. Well, today we have here a whiskey that is very, very, very trendy. Well, first I want to thank our friends at Izoomer who sent us this bottle. You already know that they collaborate a lot with the channel and send us quite interesting things. So Glenalley, under the guidance of their guru, Master Distiller Billy Walker, has done something that some brands do relatively often, which is to create the smoky version of Glenalley, which they have decided to name with this cryptic, unusual name, Meigle. I don't know how the hell this is pronounced in English, Gaelic, or anything, right? But well, if it's written here, I'll go with it. Well, I don't know. I don't even know what it means, or if it's some kind of Gaelic craziness. Well then, peculiarities, what is a Speyside whiskey? You already know that Glenale here is a Speyside whiskey, meaning this would be the smoky side of Glenale here, like it could be Valitin of Caradur, or if I'm not mistaken, for example, the Dyke of Tobermory. I mean, that style of brands where you have two versions, which I really like because you can appreciate the non-smoky version and the smoky version. So it is a 5-year-old whiskey with no added color, non-chill filtered, and has 50% ABV, which is quite appreciated because there are few smoky ones like that, let's say, boom. At first, you find them at such high strengths, which is interesting because it always allows you to dilute a bit, adjusting it to your taste, and it tells us that it has 35 ppm. It has a very curious thing, that is to say that an intense smoke load is to be expected. It has a very curious thing, and that is that it is aged in first fill ex-bourbon barrels, virgin oak barrels, and also ex-rye barrels, that is rye. It is quite a curious mix in terms of the woods. And then he says that it has a high ABV, indeed 50%, without adding coloring or filtering. It is a very young whiskey, 5 years old, a whiskey that costs, I have seen, around $60, and we are going to serve it. What's going on with everyone? The bottle, as you can see, well, I've noticed, I think it tells us exactly the same thing. Yes, it tells us the same about the bourbon, virgin oaks, ray casks, some tasting notes. A very, very interesting smell arrives here. What is happening with the whiskies that Glenallach is making lately and that Billy Walker is making? I like the Glenalley brand, but even though the distributor sent me the bottle, you know that we are 100% honest here. In my opinion, it is a brand that is somewhat overrated. In other words, it is a brand that is doing things very well, but it has gained a hype that for me is a bit disproportionate. So, this Meikle Toir tries, I believe, let's say, to fill that gap, that is, to complement what Glenal is doing here, because the madness of Glenal here with the woods is an absolute nonsense. In other words, there is such a quantity and variety of aging processes, which is what I have always said, both for and against. For me, it is something that can play both in favor and against. I mean, when I see a whiskey brand that has 50 varieties of whiskey, damn, it puts me off a bit, like, how is it possible that you have 50 varieties of whiskey? Look, I prefer that you have 10 and make me 10 pata negra really fine and well done, without deviating from that, rather than experimenting so much. Well, Glennar here is the other expression. This man, Billy Walker, is the other side. What happens? When you experiment a lot, sometimes you create very good things, but there are many more chances that you make something that doesn't really stand out, which is what personally happens to me with this brand. That is to say, Glenallach K, for example, which won the Super Tal Award, yes, I think it's an amazing whiskey, a very good whiskey, but I don't think it's as great as people say. However, I like the 12 more. A bit relative, all of this. Let's take a look at this Meikle Toir, which, as I mentioned, is around $60. So, of course, a whiskey aged for 5 years. $50 or $60 competes with a kind of Arbeck V. It's a bit more economical, but it's in that range. I think it is somewhat intended to compete with those young smoky whiskies. They have no other choice because I imagine these are the first releases they are putting out. I know there are more versions of Meikle Toir, but I think this is the one that is most commonly seen in stores right now. So, well, let's see what we find on the nose here. Well, the first note is evidently, as it couldn't be otherwise, very smoky. There is a lot of smoke, much more than medicinal. Although there is also something medicinal, but above all, the smoke predominates. It's curious because it's not common for whiskies, and for being 50%, the alcohol integration is very good. That's the way it is. Behind it, there are notes of wood, resins, and perhaps a bit of intense whiskey. It is a strong whiskey, not one you can hold to your nose. For half an hour, there are fresh herbal notes. But above all, as I said, smoke predominates, along with coastal and maritime notes. And it is a whiskey that indeed has something different compared to the smoky Islay whiskies. You can tell that there is, I don't know what peat they have used. I understand that it might be some peat from the area there, or I don't know where. Or maybe, well, I don't think they bought the malt already smoked directly. I don't know. I imagine not. Of course, a note is indeed perceived. It is a smooth whiskey. It is a delicate whiskey. It is a smoky Speyside. That's the main thing. Just a little bit, I think. The best way to put it. It reminds me quite a bit of Speyside, which is saying something. This brand I have here, the expression which is Nash, which has no age, and goes around. Yes, it goes around. It hardly reminds me of a Glenal here. Hardly at all. A Glenal here seems like something else to me. Let's see. I'm going to say something outrageous. But it reminds me much more of something like a smoky Cardhu. Something of these characteristics with a lot. Obviously without any Pedro Jimenez or anything like that, but a lot of cereal notes, a lot of notes. You can really notice the malt, the barley. It is a single malt by far. And it must be acknowledged that the nose is very good. The nose is excellent. It is very well done because it has above all a note of smoke. Normally on the nose, what I perceive are more iodine notes, more medicinal notes, some slightly more maritime notes, and I find the smoke or barbecue more on the palate. But not in this case. In this case, the smoke note is clearly perceptible. A bit of tar, a bit of pitch, those kinds of very maritime notes. Very salty as well, very maritime. The woods do not have a strong presence, in my opinion. It is more the ex-bourbon that predominates here. And surely that ex-virgin oak is also giving the very sweet notes on the nose. Extraordinary work in wood and distillation, this must be said indeed. Well, let's see on the palate. Cheers. Very good alcohol integration as well. A lot of smoke on the palate. It's definitely a bit spicy. A bit peppery. Not as sweet as one might expect from a, let's say, a Speyside whiskey. That is, on the palate, it does indeed resemble an Islay whiskey more, but on the palate, however, it does remind me a bit more of a Glenal here, in general. Here it is a Speyside whiskey, but it is a Speyside whiskey with quite a bit of character and very marked wood notes, with some strong tannins and other strong elements. So, on the palate, it definitely would be. On the palate, I could indeed identify a Glenal here at a given moment. Here it reminds me more of a Glenal 10 or something like that. It is rough, it is hard, but it is chewable. A lot of smoke notes, and also a bit spicy, right? Wood, spices. We find a bit of pepper. The alcohol integration is very good. Look, it's a simple whiskey. It's a simple whiskey. It's a straightforward whiskey. It's a 5-year-old whiskey. So I think the nose is better than the palate. I mean, on the palate, it seems like a whiskey that doesn't stand out too much. On the nose, it's certainly extraordinary. I like it much more. But it is a rich smoky whiskey. I mean, it is a 50% smoky whiskey, a smoky whiskey, but it is not the first smoky whiskey I would give to someone to start with smoky whiskeys. It is not a Kale Ila 12 at all. Closer to what, if I could compare it, I would say it is a kind of hybrid between a... Something surprises me, but I would say it's a kind of hybrid. For some reason, it reminds me of a blended whiskey. I don't know which one, but I have a blended taste in my mouth. But it would be a kind of hybrid between a Cardhu, a Laphroaig, and an Ardbeg. A sort of strange mix between those types. Between a friendly, drinkable Speyside, but at the same time it has those hard, strong notes of an Ardbeg, and at the same time it has that intense and rich smokiness, but not as powerful as that of a Laphroaig, which is not precisely too smoky, but rather medicinal. But well, to give you some guidance, it doesn't remind me at all of a Lagavulin. Not at all. Although it has a hint of it. I mean, it's not that type of whiskey. It is a stronger, more intense whiskey than one might initially expect. Well, I would say that as your first smoky whiskey, with your permission, I am going to take another sip. Yes, it is definitely a bit more astringent and drier on the palate than I expected, but it was something a bit more fruity. But it is clear that as a first smoky whiskey, they have done a good job. I think it is one of the first, we need to give them a bit more time. In my opinion, it is a whiskey that is a bit unfinished. I mean, it's perhaps too much. To me, it seems too antagonistic with Glenalec. That is to say, while Glenalec is a strong whiskey, an intense whiskey, it is closer to the dryness of a Cragganmore, of that type of whiskies, than to the, let's say, sweetness or finesse, the delicacy of a Speyside whiskey. I see it more as a whiskey where the woods have left a rather strong imprint of tannin on the palate. However, the nose is much smoother, much more pleasant, and seems better constructed to me. In short, a whiskey that I recommend to you. Yes, I think you should. If you are a fan of Glenal here, as the vast majority of you are, then I recommend it to you. But my impression is that if you're not a big fan of smoky flavors, you'll keep buying the regular Glenallachie. Good job. Ultimately, it is not my favorite smoky whiskey at all. It is not a whiskey I would restock, but it is a whiskey I could buy once without any problem, try it, and enjoy it. An intense whiskey, a strong whiskey. This is not a summer whiskey by any means. So that's it for today's video, today's tasting. I hope you liked it, that you were entertained, and as I always say, that you learned something. Remember, since you've made it this far, like, comment, subscribe, all those things that help us a lot. Thanks to Asumer for sending us the bottle, always sending us interesting and delicious whiskeys. And nothing, be very happy, which is the most important thing. Remember, without being happy, well, you tell me what we are doing here. Big hug, take good care of yourself. See you soon. Goodbye. Dear friend and beloved companion Yusan,